Hello, and welcome to Abigail Swoboda's Oral History Podcast Project, wherein I interview my grandfather, Ron Swoboda. During the 60s, my grandfather graduated high school, went to college, got his draft notice, got married, had 2 kids, one of which was my father, Brian, and helped the Mets win the World Series in '69. Living in New York during the time of so much political protest and also participating in a USO tour to Vietnam while being anti-war, I was curious to see how he responded to his surroundings given he has always been pretty left of center politically. Thank you for listening.
Well, anytime you're ready.
Okay, I guess my first question is pretty basic. I thought it'd be cool if you could describe what you were doing during the 60s, kind of like give us context for your life, and for the rest of the questions I'll ask whatever you want to say.
Sure. Well, I mean, I was, in the early 60s. I graduated high school in 1962, and after I graduated high school, I went to the University of Maryland, and of course that was during the Vietnam era, and everybody was starting to get a little worried about the war in Vietnam and whether it would have an effect on their lives, guys especially, because of the draft that existed back then. And they once they started drafting people, it was a concern. And of course, in 1964, I went away to play professional baseball, and of course, you're playing professional baseball, and you're living in, you're kind of oriented towards New York, and you're oriented towards a more, progressive, liberal, whatever you want to call it, approach towards the Vietnam War. I didn't have a lot of faith in the government's position on the Vietnam War, and so I didn't believe the Gulf of Tonkin incident was legitimate. I didn't believe that the domino theory was legit. So it was just one of those things where you're caught, where professionally I'd rather not go fight some war or get involved in this and interrupt my baseball career, which could have been disastrous to my career, especially for something that I didn't believe in. So that was going on there. And then, of course, your grandmother and I, Cecilia, got married in 1966, and that was a deferment when you were married at one point. And it happened right around the time that I was getting served my draft notice. And then they rescinded that deferment, and you had to have a child in your marriage before you had a deferment. And wouldn't you know it, your Uncle Ron was conceived, and that was the deferment that got me clear of the Vietnam War. But I went away to play Major League Baseball, minor league baseball first, in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and a little bit in Buffalo in AAA. And then, of course, in 1965, I was a rookie with the New York Mets, and I was in New York. And of course, New York was extremely liberal and anti-war, and a lot of things were going on in New York, identity politics, and I was hanging out with a guy who was what I call a long-haired hippie poet, who was a Jewish guy who taught at NYU, and he taught English, and he and I became friends, and he was a great baseball fan, but we also talked politics, So I was getting an education while I was hanging out and playing baseball and trying to make myself into the best major leaguer I could make myself. But that was what was going on then. And then, of course, in 68, after the season in 68, after the season in 69, when we won the World Series in 1969, in both years, I went on USO tours to Vietnam because I felt like since most of these guys had gone over there as conscripts, in other words, they didn't volunteer, I thought, for somebody who didn't have to go, I thought it'd be a decent move if I went over there and let them know that we were thinking about them. So I did that in 1968 for 3 weeks, and 1969 in a USO tour, and it was eye-opening to say the very least.
Yeah, did that experience change your perception of the war at all, or
no? It only reinforced
it.
It only reinforced what I considered governmental insanity. A war that cost us tremendous amount of lives. 53,000 Americans died in that, and we don't even know how many Vietnamese because we didn't bother to count. But you saw going over there. I visited all of the military bases, and you just saw that we're over there inflicting ourselves in their world and bombing away, and there was never any way that communism over there was any sort of an existential threat to us. So it was disturbing. And you talk to, there were people, obviously military people, who thought that was exactly what we ought to be doing. And there were also people who understood that this was an incredibly historic waste of capital, both human and economic capital, a waste of that. So it was eye-opening, though, to go see Vietnam on the ground, see some of what we had done there. I had read plenty about the history there, so I had some bottom line sense of what was going on. But it was the major issue of the time, though, and I felt like when you saw the amount of American equipment and materiel and men and women over there, you couldn't be struck by what a terrible waste of our efforts. And yet, as I said to you, it was an incredibly good time for the economics in America because the war industries were feeding the economy, and the economy was burgeoning. In 1969, we had, while they were still pretty seriously involved, they had started to take some money out of the war. Nixon was the president, and they were trying to, what they called, Vietnamize it. In other words, Vietnamization was turning the war over to the South Vietnamese, who couldn't handle it in the first place.
I think you could maybe co-teach the class at this point.
Yeah.
No, it's ringing true with a lot of the stuff we've talked about in class. It's cool. I know that you mentioned also, you were in New York at an interesting time also for protest, with coming out of civil rights movement into anti-war movement, and then later women's lib and gay rights. Were you involved in any of that, or how did it affect your life?
No, we were aware of it because you're in New York. We're playing baseball, and we were like boys in the bubble. We knew what was going on out there, but our lives were pretty much proscribed by playing baseball, trying to be baseball players. my sympathies were with that, and I always felt like that whole hippie thing that was going on was pretty interesting, and um, you know, back then, because they were the center of protest, and they could do it because back then you could literally take a year off, and colleges that were spitting out graduates and all, corporations were just hungry to suck them up and offer them really big jobs coming out of college. Not like today, where if you're not in some sort of an intern program, by your sophomore, junior year, you're really behind the curve. It wasn't anything like that. They were so hungry for talent that you could literally say, I'm not ready to do that. I'm going to go travel and find myself and something like that, which you could do, because at the end of that period of time, and it fed, I think, young people into a more ideological, more liberal ideology, because they could act on what they felt, rather than feel like economically they had to get involved economically. They could take a stance and based on what they felt, honestly. So that part was very, very different from now. And then you had, go back and look, in 1969 you had the Stonewall Inn riots in New York, which were, it was a gay protest to the cops hassling homosexuals in the bars in New York. They jumped on that. There was Betty Friedan and Bella Abzug, and a sort of women's lib movement that was going on then, and was very powerful in the late 60s. It was, and of course you had Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, but that civil rights thing was still powerful and got even more militant, I think, as a result of Martin Luther King's assassination. So politics got a lot harder edge on it. It was some pretty serious and interesting stuff.
Sorry, I'll try and be a little bit louder. I was saying that I know you're a bit of a history buff, so I was wondering if you had read anything more recently about that era and how that has shaped, I don't know, any kind of reflections now back on that time period, or reflections about the present day based upon what happened in the past. I don't know.
Well, like everybody who might be of a more progressive bent in politics, we are just completely outraged and frightened by the current occupancy of the White House. We just don't understand it. Don't understand the permission that seems to be given out of the White House for being this, for racism and everything that comes with that sort of attitude about others, anybody with a different color skin and all. I'm outraged at that, because I just believe in a diversity. To me, is a powerful thing and a strength. If you do it right, and if you use it as a source of strength and use it as a source of intelligence, it's a wonderful thing. And I'm ready to believe that that's the way we need to go, and that's the change of direction we need to make from what's been happening the last 2-3 years.